Julian Vane stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his glass tower, his silhouette framed against the shimmering Manhattan skyline. At 34, he was the architect of a global tech empire, a man whose name was whispered in boardrooms with equal parts admiration and fear. He had everything wealth beyond measure could buy: a face on every magazine cover, a suit that cost more than most people's annual salary, and power that moved markets. Yet, as he adjusted his sapphire cufflinks, he felt a familiar, cold ache, that hollow place inside his soul that no amount of success had ever been able to fill. He was a man who had grown up in an orphanage, where the only thing he truly owned was a name and a pair of shoes with holes in the soles. He had spent his adult life building walls and becoming effective rather than happy, guarding his heart like a fortress with the drawbridge permanently raised. He had conquered every business challenge, but he had never experienced the warmth of being loved just for being himself, rather than for what he could do for others. Tomorrow was supposed to be the wedding of the century. He was set to marry Clara Ashworth, a socialite who seemed to possess the genuine warmth he had craved his entire life. But Julian wasn't a fool. He was a survivor who had learned that the eyes often tell you what the mouth will not. 3 days ago, he had discovered the truth. His future mother-in-law, Eleanor Ashworth, was secretly facing a bankruptcy that would strip her family of their prestigious estate and Tower of Justice reputation. To Eleanor, this marriage wasn't a union of souls. It was a $10 million transaction. "Julian, darling, you really must stop brooding. The rehearsal dinner guests are waiting," Eleanor trilled, sweeping into his office. She was draped in vintage silk and grandmother's pearls, but her eyes held the calculating sharpness of a hawk. She looked at him not as a son, but as a walking bank account. Julian reached into the pocket of his tailored suit and felt the crisp edges of a white envelope. Inside sat a check for exactly $10 million, a wedding gift intended to save the Ashworth legacy and prove his devotion. But the ghost of the boy from the orphanage whispered a warning. Did they love the man who built the empire, or just the empire itself? He remembered the lessons of his past. Status is nothing but packaging, and real value is found in the dirt, not the glitter. "I'll be there shortly, Eleanor," Julian said, his voice like ice. Once she departed, Julian headed to the deepest level of his private garage. He walked past the rows of Italian sports cars and armored SUVs, stopping at a corner covered by a heavy tarp. He pulled it back to reveal a 1982 Ford F-150. It was a piece of junk to the world, rusted, with peeling blue paint, and a tailpipe that rattled like a bag of nails. It was the only possession his father had left him, a legacy of honest labor. Julian climbed into the cab, the smell of cedar and old oil filling his lungs. He placed the $10 million check on the cracked dashboard. He would arrive at the cathedral in this truck. He would give them the nobody from the orphanage instead of the billionaire. "Tomorrow," Julian whispered, "we find out who is really standing at that altar." He was prepared to give them his fortune, but only if they were prepared to accept his truth. The Cathedral of St. Jude stood like a titan of white marble against the morning sun, its Gothic spires reaching for a heaven that many inside only visited for social status. This was the stage for the wedding of the century, a carefully curated performance of power and pedigree. Outside, the street was a shimmering river of elite black car services, sleek, silent limousines, and luxury sedans that cost more than a suburban home. Each vehicle was a monument to wealth, depositing men in custom-tailored tuxedos and women draped in silk that flowed like liquid gold. The silence of the prestigious square was suddenly shattered by a sound that did not belong. It began as a rhythmic, metallic clatter, like a bag of nails being shaken in a hollow drum. Then came the backfire, a sharp crack that echoed off the cathedral walls like a gunshot, making the high society guests flinch in unison. Turning the corner was the rusted 1982 Ford F-150. It chugged and wheezed, a cloud of grey exhaust trailing behind it like a ghost of the working class. It was a piece of junk in a world of polished chrome, its rusted fenders and peeling blue paint screaming of labour and poverty. Julian steered the rattling beast toward the centre of the red carpet, right behind a pristine Rolls-Royce. He could feel the physical weight of the stairs as he pulled to a halt. The elite guests, who had been laughing moments before, now watched with expressions that could have frozen the sun. "Is this some kind of sick joke?" a socialite whispered, her voice dripping with the kind of classist venom Julian had heard his entire life. The snickers and murmurs rose like a tide. "Disgusting. Street trash. Someone should call the authorities." They saw the truck and immediately assigned a 0 value to the driver, proving Julian's theory that perception is reality in their world. Julian turned off the engine, which gave one final, shuddering cough before going silent. He took a deep breath, feeling the $10 million check in his breast pocket, the currency of devotion he was prepared to give, but only if they proved worthy. He stepped out, not in the bespoke tuxedo the press expected, but in a clean, simple suit. He had chosen to look like a nobody rather than a titan of industry. His face remained a neutral mask, but his eyes, sharp and observant, noted every sneer. He had learned long ago that the eyes tell you what the mouth will not. As he approached the massive oak doors, 2 security guards in gold-braided uniforms stepped forward to block his path. Their faces were set in hard lines of exclusion. "Deliveries are in the alley, pal," one sneered, his lip curling in disgust. "Move this pile of scrap metal before we have it towed at your expense." "I am not here for a delivery," Julian said, his voice a low, steady vibration that usually commanded boardrooms, but now fell on deaf ears. "Yeah, right," the other guard laughed mockingly. "The groom is Julian Vane, one of the richest men in the country. You look like the guy who mops his floors. Get lost before you bring shame to the ceremony." Julian stood his ground, a cold irony settling in his chest. He was experiencing the raw honesty of the elite when the glitter is stripped away. He looked toward the top of the steps and saw Eleanor Ashworth emerging, her face turning a shade of red that signaled the coming storm. He knew then that the real test of character was about to begin. Eleanor Ashworth descended the marble steps of the cathedral like a queen whose throne had been defiled. Her vintage silk gown hissed against the stone, and her face was a shade of crimson that signaled a coming storm. To the elite guests watching from the portico, she was the epitome of grace, but as she reached the bottom of the steps, the mask of high society slipped. She didn't see the man who had built a tech empire. She only saw the blue peeling paint of the 1982 Ford and the man who dared to drive it. "Julian!" she hissed, her voice vibrating with a classist venom that made the nearby bridesmaids flinch. She didn't wait for a greeting. "What is the meaning of this theatrical display of poverty? Have you lost your mind?" She gestured wildly at the truck, which was still emitting a faint, rhythmic tick as the engine cooled. "Get this piece of village trash into the alley immediately. The press are already gathering at the north gate, and I will not have the Ashworth name dragged through the mud because you decided to play working man on your wedding day." Julian stood his ground, his hands folded calmly in front of him. He could feel the $10 million check in his breast pocket, the currency of devotion that was intended to save Eleanor's failing foundation. He watched her carefully, noting the way her eyes darted toward the street, terrified of exposure. He remembered the lessons of his childhood. That perception is reality in this world, and Eleanor was currently drowning in a reality she couldn't control. Eleanor stepped closer, her perfume clashing with the faint scent of motor oil. "You look pathetic," she whispered, her voice a low, jagged blade. "In fact, you smell of old flowers and disappointment, Julian. Do you have any idea how much effort I put into making you appear acceptable to our circle? And you show up looking like the man who mops my floors." Her fear was palpable. She was worried the world would realize the vain fortune was a fabricated lie if the groom arrived in a vehicle that screamed of the orphanage he had worked so hard to escape. She leaned in, her eyes calculating and hungry, even through her rage. "You should be grateful for the honor of marrying into this family," she snapped. "Clara is a diamond, and you are, well, you are lucky we were willing to overlook your shortcomings for the sake of the merger. Now move that pile of scrap metal before I have the guards tow it into the river." Julian didn't argue. He had learned long ago that the eyes tell you what the mouth will not, and Eleanor's eyes were currently reciting a list of every debt she planned to pay with his money. He remained a ghost in the conversation, observing the woman who was supposed to be his mother-in-law. He saw no love, no respect, only a transaction that was failing to meet her aesthetic standards. "I'll move the truck, Eleanor," Julian said, his voice as smooth as the glass of his office tower, yet carrying an unsettling stillness that made her pause. He climbed back into the cab, the cracked leather seat a reminder of where he came from. As he steered the rattling vehicle toward the shadows of the side alley, he felt the hollow place in his chest grow a little colder. The test had begun, and so far the Ashworth integrity was failing spectacularly. He knew that by the time he reached the altar, he would know exactly what that $10 million check was actually worth. Julian stepped through the massive oak doors of the sanctuary, transitioning from the dim, motor oil-scented shadows of the side alley to the blinding white light of the cathedral's nave. The transition was jarring, a movement from the raw honesty of his father's world into a place of carefully constructed lies, where status was the only currency that didn't devalue. As he moved down the long marble aisle, the silence was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic squeak of his simple shoes that looked like they belonged in a village market rather than a high society wedding. He felt the physical weight of the stairs from the city's elite. To these people, he was an anomaly that had defiled their sacred space of wealth, a specimen to be observed with a mixture of horror and derision. He looked toward the altar, searching for Clara. She was draped in vintage lace and diamonds, standing like a statue of ice. Julian hoped for a sign, a softening of her gaze, a gesture that said she loved the man who had grown up in an orphanage, not the chairman of a tech empire. But Clara's face remained a mask of pale embarrassment. She wouldn't even meet his eyes, her gaze fixed resolutely on the floral arrangements. It was a heartless answer before a single word had been spoken. He realized then that she was selective about her devotion, just like her mother. She only wanted the version of him that was packaged in a $5,000 tuxedo and a limited edition limousine. At the front of the cathedral, Eleanor was waiting, her jaw tightened to the point of breaking. As Julian took his place at the altar, she leaned in, her voice a sharp, jagged whisper that hissed like a snake. "You have brought shame to this entire ceremony, Julian," she rasped, her eyes calculating and hungry, even in the midst of her fury. "Look at you. You look like a beggar who wandered in off the street to steal the silver. If the press sees these photos, the merger is dead before the ink is dry." The word merger hit him like a physical blow. To Eleanor, this wasn't a union of souls. It was a business transaction, disguised as a sacrament. She was currently performing a surgery on the grief of her own failing foundation, and he was nothing more than the walking bank account intended to pay for the procedure. Julian looked at the check sitting in his pocket, $10 million that could save the Ashworths from bankruptcy. He felt the hollow place in his chest expand. He had spent his adult life trying to be effective rather than happy, building walls and guarding his heart like a fortress with the drawbridge permanently raised. But now he realized that the people in this room were more broken than the children he had grown up with on a dirt floor. He looked at Clara one last time, needing to hear her voice. "Clara," he whispered, his voice carrying an unsettling stillness. "Does it really matter how I arrived? Is an old truck more important than our future together?" Clara's lip curled in a way that reminded him of Eleanor's classist venom. "Stop being a child, Julian," she snapped under her breath, her eyes cold as winter storms. "Status is everything in this city. You've made us a laughingstock. If you don't sign the business documents after the vows, I don't know why I'm even standing here." The ticking clock of his patience finally reached 0. He saw the truth now. He was being treated like a domestic appliance to be purchased for her convenience. He had entered this cathedral looking for a family, but he had found only a jail of expectations. The eyes tell you what the mouth will not, and Clara's eyes were telling him that he was only worth knowing if he came with a title and a checkbook. A cold, ice-cold clarity settled over him. He would not be used. He would not allow his father's legacy to be traded for a loveless arrangement. The performance was over. The air in the sanctuary felt thin, as if the collective breath of the city's elite was being held in a singular, judgmental lung. The priest, a man whose vestments were as heavy with history as the cathedral itself, cleared his throat. The sound echoed off the marble walls like a gavel in a courtroom. "If any man can show just cause why these two may not lawfully be joined together," he intoned, his voice a low vibration that seemed to vibrate in Julian's very marrow. "Let him now speak, or else hereafter forever hold his peace." The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was a jail of expectations. Julian felt the physical weight of the stairs pressing against his back. Beside him, Eleanor didn't wait for a stranger to speak. She leaned toward him, her perfume clashing with the faint, honest scent of motor oil still clinging to his skin. "I object," she whispered, a sharp, jagged sound intended only for his ears. "Your presence in that pile of scrap metal is an objection to everything this family stands for. You have brought shame to this altar." Julian didn't look at Eleanor. He turned his head slowly to look at Clara. She stood before him, a statue of ice draped in lace that cost more than the orphanage where he had spent his childhood. He needed to know if there was a person beneath the packaging. He needed to know if his hollow place could finally be filled with something real. "Clara," Julian whispered, his voice carrying an unsettling stillness that made her finally meet his eyes. "Before we say these vows, I have one question. Does the truck, the only thing my father ever truly owned, change who I am to you? If I am just the man who arrived in that piece of junk, am I still the man you want to marry?" Clara's face, usually a mask of carefully constructed lies, shifted into a look of pure, heartless disdain. She didn't offer a hand or a word of comfort. Instead, she adjusted her veil with a clinical precision. "Stop being a child, Julian," she snapped, her voice a low blade of classist venom. "Status is everything in this city. You've made us a laughingstock. Do you have any idea what the press will say? If you don't sign the merger documents immediately after the ceremony, I don't know why I'm even standing here." The ticking clock of Julian's patience finally reached 0. In that moment, he realized he wasn't being welcomed into a family. He was being purchased as a domestic appliance to save a failing reputation. He remembered the words of his past, that being effective rather than happy was a lonely way to live, and that a relationship built on a business transaction was just another fortress with the drawbridge permanently raised. "I see," Julian said, and for the first time in years, the hollow place inside him didn't feel empty. It felt cold and clear. He realized that being strong all the time means being alone all the time, but being used meant losing his soul. He had spent his adult life building an empire from nothing, guarding his heart like a treasure, only to realize he was about to give it to people who only valued the currency of his bank account. Julian took a deliberate step back from the altar. The movement was stiff with exhaustion, but his head was held high. A collective gasp rippled through the pews, a wave of shock from the very people who had been snickering at his truck moments before. The priest blinked, his prayer book trembling. "Julian!" Clara hissed, her pale embarrassment turning into genuine fear as she saw her $10 million security blanket moving away. "The merger is off, Clara," Julian said, his voice now loud enough to reach the back of the cathedral. "And so is this wedding." He looked at Eleanor, whose calculating and hungry eyes were wide with disbelief. "You didn't want a husband for your daughter. You wanted a walking bank account to perform surgery on the grief of your bankruptcy. But I am not an account. I am a man." He turned away from the altar of judgment, leaving the statue of ice and the classist venom behind him. As he walked back down the marble aisle, his simple shoes clicking against the stone, Julian felt a strange new sensation. It wasn't the triumph of a billionaire, it was the raw honesty of a man who had finally chosen himself. He had arrived in a rusty truck, but he was leaving with something far more valuable than a $10 million check. His dignity, the silence that followed Julian's withdrawal from the altar, was so absolute it felt like the very stone of the cathedral was holding its breath. The city's elite, frozen in their pews, looked on with wide, unblinking eyes, their whispers of street trash and nobody replaced by a collective, terrified realization that the script of the wedding of the century had been shredded. Eleanor Ashworth was the first to find her voice, though it wasn't the voice of a refined socialite. It was the shrill, jagged sound of a woman watching her last lifeline slip beneath the waves. She rushed toward Julian at the altar, her vintage silk gown hushing against the marble, her face no longer red with anger, but white with the kind of primal fear that comes from the threat of exposure. "Julian, stop this madness!" she hissed, her voice a low, desperate vibration intended only for him. "You are being impulsive and reckless. Think of the press. Think of the Ashworth name. We can fix this. We can explain the truck as a whimsical tribute to your roots, but you must sign the merger documents, the foundation, the Tower of Justice. It cannot survive another day without the endowment." Julian looked at her, his expression an impassive mask of granite. He had spent his life building a tech empire from nothing, but in this moment he felt like the orphan boy again, seeing clearly for the first time that the packaging of high society was nothing but a jail of expectations. "The foundation," Julian repeated, his voice smooth and carrying an unsettling stillness that cut through Eleanor's panic. "You don't care about the marriage, Eleanor. You don't even care about Clara's happiness. You only care about the transaction." "It's not a transaction. It's a legacy," Eleanor snapped, her classist venom returning as she realized Julian was no longer playing his role. "Quit pretending to be a moral hero. You're a businessman. You know that everything has a price. Now give me the check. Hand over the charity case money you promised for the firm, and we can finish these vows before the reporters break through the security." Julian reached into the breast pocket of his simple suit. The movement was slow, deliberate, as if he were performing surgery on the grief that had buried his hope for a genuine family. He pulled out the white envelope. He could feel the physical weight of every eye in the room, focusing on that small piece of paper. He opened the envelope and held up the check. The numbers were impossibly large. $10 million. It was a monument to wealth, the exact amount needed to perform surgery on the debt that was killing the Ashworth legacy. Eleanor's eyes went wide. They were calculating and hungry, fixed on the paper with a desperation that bordered on the grotesque. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers twitching as if she could already feel the currency of power between them. "There it is," she whispered, her voice stripped of its pretense. "Give it to me, Julian. Let's save everything." Julian looked at the check, then at Clara, who was still standing like a statue of ice, her face a mask of pale embarrassment, but her eyes darting toward the check with the same greed as her mother. He realized then that the eyes tell you what the mouth will not. They didn't see Julian Vane, the man who had fought his way out of an orphanage. They saw a walking bank account, a domestic appliance to be purchased for their convenience. "You're right, Eleanor," Julian said, his voice ringing through the nave like a bell of truth. "Everything does have a price, but my integrity is not for sale." With a swift, rhythmic motion, Julian gripped the edges of the check. The sound of the paper tearing was sharp, a rhythmic rip that echoed off the Gothic arches like a thunderclap. He didn't stop once. He tore it again and then again, his hands moving with the precision of a man who was dismantling a hollow empire. "No!" Eleanor screamed, lunging forward as if she could catch the pieces in mid-air. But it was too late. Julian opened his hand, and the scraps of paper, the remains of $10 million, fell like snow onto the cold marble floor of the cathedral. The city's elite watched in horrified silence as the wedding gift was reduced to litter. "You didn't want a husband for your daughter," Julian declared, looking Eleanor directly in the eyes. "You wanted a merger. You wanted a lifeline for your bankruptcy. But I have learned that moral integrity is the only currency that never devalues, and I refuse to spend another second in a room where status is more important than the truth." He turned to Clara, whose mask of lace and diamonds now looked like a shroud of lies. "I came here in that truck to see if you could love the nobody I used to be. You proved that you only loved the billionaire I became, and for that reason, Clara, I am leaving this altar a free man." He stepped over the scraps of the $10 million check, his head held high, leaving the Ashworths to drown in the reality they had so carefully tried to hide. The performance was over, and the raw honesty of Julian's new life was just beginning. 3 armored black SUVs screeched to a halt on the plaza outside, their tires smoking against the pavement. The massive oak doors burst open, and a phalanx of security personnel in grey tactical suits marched in, led by a man whose sharp features and tablet computer signaled a different kind of war. "Chairman Vane," Marcus, Julian's chief of staff, said as he reached the altar. He ignored the gasps of the congregation and bowed with a precision that radiated raw honesty and absolute deference. "The acquisition is complete. The documents were filed 3 minutes ago." Eleanor's face shifted from rage to a look of utter bewilderment. "Chairman, Vane, Julian, what is this performance? Who are these people?" Julian adjusted his simple cuffs, his gaze as impassive as a statue of ice. He looked at Eleanor, then at Clara, noting how the eyes tell you what the mouth will not. Clara's eyes were no longer filled with pale embarrassment. They were wide with a terrifying realization that she had just thrown away the most powerful man in the city. "You were so focused on the packaging, Eleanor, that you failed to look at the contents," Julian said, his voice a low, steady vibration that commanded the room. "You spoke of a merger as if my life was a business deal to save your failing investment firm, Ashworth and Sons. But in my world, I don't just sign checks. I solve problems, and your firm was a problem. Marcus tapped his screen. As of 10:42 a.m., Vane Global Holdings has completed a hostile takeover of Ashworth and Sons. You are no longer the CEO, Eleanor. In fact, you are no longer an employee. You've been fired for gross financial mismanagement. Eleanor staggered back, her hand clutching the altar for support. You bought my legacy? I bought your debt, Julian corrected, his tone ice cold. And since you think so little of the working class, you'll find the terms of your severance quite humble. But it doesn't stop there. You see, I grew up in an orphanage with dirt floors, and I learned very young that knowledge shouldn't be caged. I own the land this cathedral sits on. I own the mortgage on the Ashworth family estate. I arrived in my father's truck today to see if there was any integrity left in this house. I found only carefully constructed lies. Clara finally moved, her lace gown rustling as she stepped toward him. Julian, darling, I was confused. The stress of the wedding, the truck. I didn't mean those things. We can still do this. We can start over. She reached for his hand, her face a mask of desperate, selective devotion. Julian stepped back, the movement stiff with exhaustion, from years of being effective rather than happy. He looked at the woman who was supposed to be his wife, and saw only the jail of expectations she represented. You weren't confused, Clara. You were honest. You only wanted the billionaire in the glass tower. You had no room for the boy in the rusty truck, and that boy is the only part of me that matters. He turned his back on the altar of judgment. Marcus, clear the room. I want this building locked. I'm converting the Ashworth estate into a state-of-the-art center for foster children. It's time that land served a purpose beyond vanity. Understood, Chairman, Marcus replied. Julian walked back down the aisle, his simple shoes clicking against the marble. He didn't look at the press, nor the stunned socialites who were now frantically trying to delete their derisive social media posts. He stepped out into the morning air and climbed back into the cab of the 1982 Ford F-150. As he turned the key, the engine gave its familiar, honest rattle. He glanced at the rearview mirror one last time. The wedding of the century was over, but for the first time in his life, the hollow place felt like it was beginning to fill with something far more valuable than status. He steered his rusty spaceship away from the cathedral, leaving the Ashworths to drown in a reality they could no longer control. He was a free man, and his true journey was just beginning. The heavy oak doors of St. Jude's Cathedral swung shut with a finality that echoed like a tombstone settling into place. Outside, the morning air was thick with the flashbulbs of 1,000 paparazzi, their cameras capturing the exact moment the Ashworth legacy began to dissolve. Eleanor Ashworth stood on the marble portico, her crumpled face a mask of pure, unadulterated horror, as she realized that the wedding of the century had just become the scandal of the decade. The city's elite, who only moments ago had been whispering about Julian's piece of junk truck, now turned their cameras and their classist venom toward the woman who had just been publicly fired and disowned by the man she tried to exploit. By 2 p.m., the ticking clock of high society karma had reached its zenith. Marcus, acting with the absolute stillness of a man who moved markets with a single phone call, had executed Julian's orders with surgical precision. He had frozen every account associated with Ashworth and Sons, pending a deep-dive investigation into Eleanor's gross financial mismanagement and the professionally fabricated documents she had used to lure Julian into the marriage contract. Eleanor and Clara found themselves homeless in high society, standing in their silk and lace, while the very people they had mocked now looked down on them as if they were contagious specimens. The Tower of Justice Foundation was revealed to be a hollow empire of debt, and the socialites who had once begged for an invitation to their estate now deleted their numbers, proving that loyalty in their world was a currency that only paid when you were winning. Julian, meanwhile, had returned to his sleek glass tower overlooking the city. He sat in his private office, the silence a stark contrast to the panicked shouting he had left behind at the cathedral. He looked out at the shimmering skyline, but the view didn't bring him the vicious satisfaction he had expected. Instead, he felt that familiar, hollow place inside his chest, the one that no amount of success had ever been able to fill. He realized that being strong all the time means being alone all the time, and though he had protected his empire, he was still the boy from the orphanage who never knew what it meant to have someone worry about him. He walked to the window, his reflection ghostly against the glass. He was a man who could destroy a career with a phone call, yet he felt exhausted, as if speaking the truth had drained something vital from him. His penthouse was modern and minimalist, filled with expensive furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. But as he stood there, he was struck by a painful truth. Expensive furniture doesn't cure loneliness. He had spent 34 years refusing to lose, but in winning this war against the Ashworths, he had only reinforced the walls of his own isolation prison. He thought back to the raw honesty of his father's truck and the dirt floors of his childhood. He remembered his grandmother's soft voice telling him that the quality of a man is seen in how he treats the smallest person, and he realized that Eleanor's greatest sin wasn't just greed. It was the patriarchal entitlement and classist disdain that allowed her to see a human being as nothing more than a domestic appliance or a walking bank account. Julian reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a single photograph, not of a business deal, but of the 1982 Ford F-150. It was a monument to labor in a world of carefully constructed lies. He knew that trust had to be earned, and integrity was the only currency that never devalued. But he also knew that he couldn't keep guarding his heart like a fortress with the drawbridge permanently raised. "Marcus," Julian said into his intercom, his voice carrying an unsettling stillness. "I'm going out. I don't want the SUV. I'm taking the truck." He needed to find a place where people were genuine and intelligent without being boastful, a place where the packaging didn't matter as much as the soul beneath. He was finished with performing a version of himself for people who only wanted access to his wealth. As he headed toward the garage, Julian made a silent promise to the boy he used to be. He would find a belonging and a value that had nothing to do with his bank balance. The fall of the greedy was complete, but the reconstruction of his own heart was just beginning. Julian steered the rattling 1982 Ford F-150 away from the neon lights of Manhattan, heading toward the quiet, dusty outskirts where the carefully constructed lies of high society couldn't reach him. He had discarded his expensive suit jacket in the passenger footwell, rolled up his sleeves, and loosened his tie until he looked less like the chairman of a global empire and more like a weary laborer searching for a sanctuary of silence. His destination wasn't a five-star hotel or a private club. It was a flickering neon sign that read, "The Silver Spire Diner," a place where the floor was made of cracked linoleum instead of polished marble. He pulled into the lot just as the engine gave a final, rhythmic tick and died. Julian sat in the cab for a moment, breathing in the scent of old oil and cedar, feeling the physical weight of the day's events slowly lift. He walked inside, the bell above the door announcing his arrival, with a cheery chime that felt more welcoming than the cathedral's vaulted silence. He sat at the counter, a ghost among the late-night truckers and night shift workers, realizing that in this room perception was reality, and his current reality was that of a man who looked like he had nothing left to lose. A woman approached him, carrying a pot of coffee and a cloth that had seen better days. Her name tag read Sarah. She had calloused hands and eyes that had clearly seen too many winters, yet they held a spark of raw honesty that Julian hadn't encountered in years. She didn't look at his sapphire cufflinks or the cut of his shirt. She only saw the exhaustion that drained something vital from his expression. "You look like you've been through a war, honey," Sarah said, pouring him a cup without asking. "Coffee's on the house if you're planning on telling a story, and $1 if you're just here to brood." Julian felt a strange ripple of comfort. "I think I've had enough stories for one lifetime," he replied, his voice carrying an unsettling stillness that usually commanded boardrooms, but now felt like a confession. Sarah didn't flinch. She treated him with a sincere interest that wasn't a transaction, a stark contrast to the selective devotion he had left at the altar. For 30 minutes they talked about simple things: the coming winter, the best way to brew a pot of tea, and the freedom found in acceptance of a life lived simply. When Julian finally stood to leave and tried to start the truck, the engine refused to turn over. It gave a pathetic wheeze and then went silent. Julian stepped out into the cold night air, popping the hood with a sigh of stiff exhaustion. He was staring at the maze of hoses and wires, feeling powerless and poor, despite the millions in his bank account, when a shadow fell over him. "You're running on a prayer and a loose belt, mister," Sarah said, stepping out of the diner with a heavy toolbox. She had changed out of her apron into grease-stained coveralls. Without waiting for permission, she reached into the engine bay, her movements fluid and quick-thinking. "My dad was a mechanic. He taught me that a person who can't fix their own machine is at the mercy of the world," he saw. As she worked, a small silver locket slipped from beneath her collar. Julian's breath caught. It was a cheap, tarnished thing, but it bore a specific engraving: a small sparrow perched on a branch. "That locket," Julian whispered. "St. Jude's?" Sarah froze, her wrench hovering over a bolt. She looked at him, her expression shifting from calculating to vulnerable. "How do you know that name? That's the orphanage I grew up in. They gave these to the girls when we aged out." "I was in the boys' wing," Julian said, his hollow place finally beginning to fill with a sense of belonging and value. "I remember the sparrow. It was the only thing that gave us hope in the darkness." They stood there in the freezing parking lot, a billionaire and a waitress, connected by a past of dirt floors and unspoken grief. Julian looked at Sarah, really looked at her, and for the first time in his adult life, his lips twitched into a real smile that reached his eyes. He realized that the packaging of his life had been a jail of expectations, and that he had finally found someone who saw the man behind the name. The truck gave a roar of life under Sarah's expert touch, but Julian wasn't ready to drive away just yet. He had found a masterpiece of a connection in the most unlikely of places. Julian sat at the expansive mahogany desk in his glass tower, but the view of the city no longer felt like a monument to his power. Instead, he looked at the legal documents spread before him, the blueprint for a future he hadn't imagined a month ago. The $10 million that was originally intended to be a business transaction, disguised as a wedding gift, was now the seed for a project he had named the Redemption Fund. He had spent his entire adult life building a hollow empire, but after the wedding of the century collapsed, he realized that being strong all the time means being alone all the time. He was finished living in an isolation prison and was ready for the reconstruction of his own heart. He picked up the phone and called Sarah. When she arrived at his office the next morning, she looked at the marble floors and the expensive furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. with a sense of wary detachment. She wasn't wearing silk or pearls. She wore the same practical clothes he'd seen her in at the diner, carrying herself with a raw honesty that was a stark contrast to the selective devotion of the socialites who usually haunted these halls. "I'm not here for a handout, Julian," she said, her voice steady and carrying that unsettling stillness he had come to admire. He smiled, noticing again that her eyes told him what her mouth would not. She had a fierce and beautiful spirit that was completely unwilling to be diminished by his wealth. "I'm not offering one," Julian replied. "I'm offering a partnership. I've purchased the Silver Spire Diner and the surrounding lots. I don't want to close them. I want to turn them into a community hub, a charity kitchen, a vocational center, and a safe haven for single parents. I need someone quick-thinking and reliable to coordinate the operations. I need someone who knows what it's like to survive on a prayer and a loose belt. I need you." Sarah's lips twitched into a genuine smile, the first one he had seen in this office in years. "A billionaire wants to trade his rusty spaceship for a soup kitchen? That's a story I'd like to help write." As they began to review the plans, a commotion erupted in the executive lobby. Eleanor Ashworth, now homeless in high society after Vane Global Holdings froze her assets, had bypassed security. Her face was crumpled and her vintage silk was stained. She looked like a specimen of the very world she once used to exclude others. "Julian, you cannot be serious," she shrieked, looking at Sarah with undisguised contempt. "You've ruined the Ashworth name. My accounts are frozen, and the press is calling me a charity case. I need that check. I deserve it for the honor of our association. You owe me for the embarrassment of that truck." Julian stood up, his movements stiff with exhaustion from the drama, but his gaze was ice-cold. He saw Eleanor for what she truly was, a woman who believed status was everything and perception was reality. "You spoke of family as a merger, Eleanor," Julian said, his voice ringing with a new authority. "You treated me like a domestic appliance to be used and discarded. But I've learned that family means protecting each other even when it's hard. You didn't want to protect me, you wanted to harvest me." "I have nothing," she sobbed, her calculating and hungry eyes now leaking genuine, desperate tears. "Everyone has a price," Julian said, echoing the very lesson she had tried to teach him. "But you can't buy your way back into integrity. If you're truly desperate for work, Sarah needs a maintenance crew at the new center. You can start by cleaning the floors you once looked down upon. It might help you learn the freedom found in acceptance of a life lived for others rather than for yourself." Eleanor gasped, her patriarchal entitlement and pride recoiling at the suggestion of manual labor. She turned and fled the office, leaving behind a silence that felt like a sanctuary. Sarah looked at Julian, her expression soft and wondering. "You really meant it, didn't you? You're choosing the nobody over the empire." "I'm choosing the truth," Julian whispered. He felt that hollow place inside his soul finally start to fill with a sense of belonging and value. He realized that moral integrity is the only currency that never devalues, and that love is the greatest masterpiece he would ever build. He wasn't just giving away money, he was finally learning how to live. Exactly 1 year had passed since the heavy oak doors of the cathedral had swung shut on the scandal of the decade. Today the sun did not rise over a monument to wealth or a gathering of the city's elite, but over the freshly painted gates of the Vane Donovan Center for Foster Youth. The former Ashworth estate, once a jail of expectations and a symbol of inherited status, had been completely transformed into a sanctuary of light and learning. The marble hallways that used to echo with classist venom were now filled with the laughter of children who, like Julian, had once known only the hollow place of an orphanage. The guest list for this ceremony looked nothing like the wedding of the century. There were no business partners looking for a merger or socialites performing selective devotion. Instead, the rows were filled with ordinary people, the night shift workers from the Silver Spire diner, the neighbors who had helped Julian when he looked like a nobody, and the staff of the new center who understood that moral integrity is the only currency that never devalues. Even Officer Hicks sat in the front row, a reminder that people can change when given the right motivation. The ceremony was held in the estate's garden, where the late autumn leaves created a canopy of gold and crimson. A small girl from the center, wearing a dress that was simple but pristine, acted as the flower girl. She didn't just toss the petals, she moved with mathematical precision, ensuring an optimal distribution pattern across the grass, a trait she had learned in her new vocational classes. When the music began, a soft melody played on a single violin rather than a thundering organ, Sarah appeared at the end of the aisle. She was breathtaking even without diamonds, wearing a gown of cream-colored silk that complemented her fierce and beautiful spirit. She didn't walk with the proprietary confidence of a socialite. She moved with the raw honesty of a woman who had built her own life with calloused hands. As she reached the altar, Julian took her hand, and the unsettling stillness that usually defined him finally melted into a genuine smile that reached his eyes. The vows they exchanged were not scripted by publicists or lawyers. "I spent my life building walls and guarding my heart like a fortress," Julian said, his voice steady and full of the heart behind the power. "I thought success meant never being at anyone's mercy, but you taught me that survival doesn't have to mean being alone. I choose you today, not because of a contract or a merger, but because you saw the boy in the rusty truck and decided he was worth knowing." Sarah squeezed his hands, her eyes bright with tears of desperate relief. "I grew up believing that trust has to be earned through struggle and silence," she replied. "But you showed me that partnership means standing beside someone through everything. I don't need a billionaire, I just need the man who was brave enough to be real. I choose to choose you every day for the rest of our lives." As they were pronounced husband and wife, the children from the center erupted in a cheer that was louder and more authentic than any polite applause Julian had ever heard in a boardroom. There were no professionally fabricated moments for the press to capture, only the miracle of a second chance being realized in real time. For their departure, Marcus, now Julian's most trusted friend, rather than just a chief of staff, didn't bring around an armored SUV or a sleek limousine. He pulled up to the garden gate in the 1982 Ford F-150. The truck was no longer a piece of junk. It had been meticulously restored, its blue paint shimmering in the afternoon sun, though Julian had insisted on keeping the original, honest rattle of the engine. Julian helped Sarah into the cab of his rusty spaceship, and as they drove away from the estate, they left behind the isolation prison of their pasts. Julian looked at the small silver locket hanging from the rearview mirror, the sparrow of St. Jude's, and realized that love is the greatest masterpiece he would ever build. They weren't just driving toward a new home, they were driving toward a future built on the freedom found in acceptance, and the truth that home is a porch where someone found you broken and chose to carry you inside. Julian stood in his new office, which was a far cry from the sterile, glass-walled cage of the tower he had once called his empire. This room was nestled in the heart of the Vane Donovan Center, where the windows didn't just overlook a skyline of cold steel, but a playground filled with the authentic laughter of children who had finally found a sanctuary. On his mahogany desk sat a single framed photograph, not of a corporate merger or a trophy, but of the blue 1982 Ford F-150. It served as a permanent reminder that his true legacy was constructed not on the carefully constructed lies of high society, but on the raw honesty of labor and the courage to be real. He occasionally heard whispers of Eleanor and Clara, who were now experiencing the crushing weight of being homeless in high society. They had learned the hard way that loyalty in their world was a currency that only paid when you were winning, and once the winning stopped, the socialites who had once flattered them deleted their numbers faster than a falling stock price. Stripped of their monument to wealth, they were left to navigate a reality where they were judged by the very standards of zero value they had once imposed on Julian. Julian felt no vicious satisfaction in their fall. He simply understood that regret is all you have left when you treat human beings like domestic appliances to be used and discarded. Beside him, Sarah leaned against the doorframe, her calloused hands a symbol of the life they had built together. She was the one who had finally filled the hollow place inside his soul that no amount of success had ever been able to touch. They were finished performing a version of themselves for a judgmental world. Together, they had proved that love is the greatest masterpiece, and that belonging and value are found in the people you choose to protect, not the things you choose to own. This is Mr. Hope reminding the Hope Nation that first impressions can be wrong, and that status is often just a jail of expectations we build for ourselves and others. We live in a society that often punishes weakness and rewards strength, but Julian Vane's journey teaches us that the bravest thing you can ever do is lower your drawbridge and let someone see the person you really are, the boy in the rusty truck. Moral integrity is the only currency that never devalues, and it is the only thing that will buy you a peace that actually lasts. Do not be afraid to drive your own rusty spaceship through a world of polished chrome if it leads you toward the truth. True success isn't measured in quarterly earnings. It's measured in the smiles instead of fear, and in becoming the person your loved ones deserve. Never step over the person the Lord delivers to your door, because that nobody might be the one carrying the key to your reconstruction of heart. If you believe that kindness is the best blueprint for a life well lived, please subscribe to the channel and join our family of story seekers. I love you all, God bless, and remember, it's never too late to turn your biggest regret into your greatest blessing. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more stories of hope.